Hey everyone, it's me, Amy Walter. Before we start the conversation, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by the Cook Political Report. If you're interested in more of our great content, consider subscribing. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. The offer is available only to new subscribers. Hello and welcome to the Odd Years. I'm Amy Walter. On the last podcast, I talked with Chauncey McLean, head of the Democratic Super PAC Future Forward, about their media strategy for Kamala Harris and why things didn't work out as they had hoped. For this podcast, we turn to the ad strategy of the Trump campaign with John Brabender, the chief creative officer for the media company BrabenderCox. Now, John was hired as Trump's ad consultant in early 2023 and worked with him throughout the entire campaign through, last November. He had incredible access to and input from Donald Trump about the ad-making process and strategy, which he shares with me here. Lots of pretty cool behind-the-curtain details of what it's like to work on the Trump campaign and specifically to work with the president when putting these messages and ads together. But I also wanted to talk to him about whether the lessons he learned working for Trump in 2024 could translate to non-Trump candidates, and specifically Republican down-ballot candidates who have to run in the 2026 midterms. We recorded this conversation on Wednesday, April 2nd. Here it is. John Brabender, hello. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, I am very happy to be here, Amy. Thank you for having me as a guest.
Presidential elections, congressional elections, you've done it all. And that's really, I wanted obviously to talk about the 2024 campaign, but I wanted really a big reason I wanted to get you specifically on the podcast was to get your perspective about the world of campaign messaging and advertising going forward, not just looking back to 2024, but how you think things are going to look in 2028. And of course, we'll talk about the midterms as well. But let's start, John, in 2024. Talk to us about what role you played on the Trump campaign and when you got there. When did you start with the campaign?
Well, yeah, it was interesting. I had talked to a number of candidates and wasn't really sure I even wanted to do a presidential. From a business standpoint, you take on a presidential race, all your other clients are like, well, I know I'm going to be the second person you're answering the phone call to. Do I really want you to do my race? And so there's some logic from a purely business consulting business standpoint of saying, hey, we're not doing a presidential race. We have more time for you. I talked to some candidates, had an offer that I turned down, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to do a presidential. And then I got a call out of nowhere from Susie Wiles, who I knew well. And this was late February of 23, I think. And she said, Chris LaCivita and I would like to talk to you about doing the campaign's media. Are you interested? And I said, let's have a conversation. She invited me down to Mar-a-Lago, and I've known Chris LaCivita for, I don't know, 20 some years, probably worked with him on different campaigns. Susie, I got to know very well in the last 2 or 3 years before that. And it was very interesting, first of all, the dynamics, because they're co-campaign managers and their personalities could not be further apart. And I thought, that's one of the things I wanted to see. How's this really going to work? What's the dynamics going to be? And I remember telling them, we met at the campaign office and we were going to take a ride over to Mar-a-Lago and have lunch. And they spent 10 minutes arguing about, politely and funny, which car they were taking, hers or him. And it honestly was like watching a married couple more than it was two co-campaign managers. But it was very clear to me immediately that it was going to work, that how they were deferential to each other, particularly in certain areas. Susie, particularly when it came to the budget. Chris, particularly when it came to the ground game or some of the messaging and so forth. And so we had about a 2 hour lunch, and I said, well, let me think about this, and got right back to him and said, I'm in. And I'll be honest, I looked at this, and at the time, the president was not even in first place in the Republican primaries. And a lot of people were skeptical, like, why would you take on this race? It has very little chance of winning. You have all the lawsuits. Everything that's going to happen is going to knock Trump out. And I found that extremely attractive. I think from a campaign perspective, strategist, marketer, it was a very complex thing, and it was very, really attractive there. I knew a lot of the people that were already on the campaign very well. Uh, Jason Miller, I knew extremely well, and I knew them all well, and I knew them to be people who were really good at what they did, but did not create drama. And
Mm.
I think that that's what they were really looking for, was particularly in a presidential race, and particularly in a presidential race, honestly, with President Trump, there's going to be a lot of things going on you can't control. So the one thing they wanted to make sure was the infrastructure we could control. And I was also on what was called the leadership team at the time, where we would do a daily call. It started with about 6 or 7 of us. Eventually, it grew probably to no more than 10. It was really the smallest run presidential campaign in history, that people will never understand that. But it was some of the most talented people ever worked with. And Susie and Chris kept the sort of drama out. Nobody dared leaked. Felt
That's the
comfortable
thing, no
weighing in.
leaks.
They're
Compared to
just
2016 and 2020, it's
and what you learn very quickly in Trump world is quite large, in the sense of, well, you got a lot of people that were there in 2016. You got a lot of people there that were in the administration. And so a lot of times you'll read, well, according to somebody close to the Trump campaign, that could be 10,000 people. I mean, but the inner circle, the people who were there every day, it was really probably the best experience I ever had on a campaign, working with a group, in the sense that how well run it really was. And I think that had a lot to do with the final result. Everybody also knew, though, there was never going to be a perfect campaign. That doesn't exist. But we could minimize it, and we weren't going to be shooting ourselves in the foot, and all those type of things. And from that standpoint, I think it was very successful.
so. As you were sitting there in February of 2023, was it already clear what this message was going to be to get Trump ahead in the primary? Or did you guys have to really, one, dig deep to figure out what that was going to be, or two, you just got the benefit of the lawsuits and the indictments gave you sort of a jet fuel there?
Yeah, well, and believe me, though, we were not sitting. Sometimes too, I think consultants want to say they were smarter than they really were, just because
Yeah.
the net results. We weren't sitting there saying, "Oh, this is great, another lawsuit. This is really going to be terrific." I don't think, if we were honest, I don't think we knew for sure what the net impact was going to be. What There was a dynamic happening, and in a sense, in looking at it, the Democrats gave us a gift. I'm not sure we looked at it at the time, but so you had Republicans basically saying, look, even if I like President Trump, I know he's going to be dealing with all these things. Maybe, and Ron DeSantis had positioned himself as Trump without the drama. That's really what he was trying to write, without these problems. But everything you like about the president, I'm there. In fact, the funny thing is, the very first ad that I did was an anti-Ron DeSantis ad before he got in the race. One of the things that I did learn, that I knew to some degree, but not to the extent, is how wide of a net the Trump social network is. I mean, it's like having another cable news channel. I'll give you maybe the best example I can give you in this was really late in the campaign. We created a 2.5 minute video regarding Jocelyn Nungaray, whose mother reached out to me 10 days before the election and said, can I do an ad for the president? Luckily, I knew exactly who Jocelyn Nungaray was when her mother called, and Jocelyn was abducted by some people who had crossed here illegally. They tortured and raped her, killed her, left her body. And in Texas, everybody knew Jocelyn Nungaray,
Right.
but not necessarily the whole United States did. Long story short, we edited this 2.5 minute, just horrible to watch. But Jocelyn's mother was just spectacular in how she addressed it. It was very hard to watch though, and so it was funny. I get a text with somebody on the campaign. I'm here on the plane with the president. He heard you're doing this video. He wants to see it right now. And I'm like, well, we just really finished editing it. Are we happy with it? But he's impatient. I sent it to them. It's a 2.5 minute video. 3.5 minutes after the president got it, he put it
Yeah.
on his sites.
Yeah.
Between that moment and election day, which would have been 6 days later, it ended up getting 52 million views. Now, to put that in context, the very final episode of the show Friends got about 52 million views. And so, as a media consultant, it took me a little while to just understand how we had this incredible medium that didn't always have to be paid, and we could reach ridiculous numbers of people. And so that takes me back to the very first ad we did, and it was the very first ad I did for the president, which again, you got to earn your respect with him. He and I'd only met him once before then, to be perfectly honest. And so it was kind of funny. I do this ad, I get it to Chris Lasavita and Susie, they get the president, and he just really loved the ad. In fact, there's a new book out called Revenge, and I think the president's quoted, and they're saying he thinks it's the best political ad he's ever seen in his life. And it was a little mockery of Ron DeSantis, who had run an ad showing his children and teaching them about what it means to be MAGA, basically. And
I remember that.
it just worked very well. But immediately you see the shares and the press and all those type of things, and you start to really get a sense. And it was really funny. President didn't even know I did that ad. He just knew somebody did that ad who's our new ad maker, right? So about 3 weeks later, I'm presenting him some strategy and messaging ad stuff and of this presentation. Before that, he says, I want to show you an ad. And I want to make sure that before you show me anything, you tell me you can do ads. I'm going to show you what a really good political ad is. And he shows me the ad that he shows me the Ron DeSantis ad I did. And it was so great because we're at Bedminster, and he's setting me up that you better be able to do something like this. And Susie sat there with a little bit of a smile on her face. And as soon as the president done, she goes, Mr. President, John's the one who did the ad. And it honestly, I cannot begin to tell you how much that made my life a lot easier, because the next thing he wanted to do is talk about ads for his golf course and everything else, And, the other thing too is we hear all these things about the difficulty of President Trump, and he fires people and all this. And believe me, I thought probably when I got hired in, late February of 23, that the chance of me being the media consultant by November of 24, regardless of what campaign in a presidential, you usually don't last that long. If somebody's behind and they're not going to fire the candidate, they fire the team, So I actually wear it as a great badge of honor that I was there on election night. But with that said, what I found is I spent a lot of time early in the campaign getting to know him, because I knew there wouldn't be time for that later. And I got a sense of what he liked and didn't like, because I have to get things approved on the air. And he would use words that he'd say, well, I like ads that are elegant. And what I learned very quickly is what he meant by that is, I don't want to see a traditional political ad that everybody else is running. I don't want it to look like a hostage video. I want it to look like there's a story, that it's honestly saying something, and that there's great music and visuals. And believe me, from a media consultant standpoint, that's what you want to hear. You want somebody that says, don't give me the same thing everybody else gives me, or I don't want to see my ad look like everybody else's. And that is the environment that you want. And it was interesting because Susie and Chris gave me great latitude. There were many a times where I would just go produce an ad and they didn't see it until it was totally produced. It wasn't like this long chain of processes. Or to be honest with you, sometimes the president would send me something, or the campaign something, where he found a clip on something or whatever and said, we should do an ad around this. And he was right, we should. And oftentimes we felt comfortable enough even putting ads on the air that the president hadn't even seen yet, because we had a good sense of what he liked.
Well, it's such an interesting contrast to conversations with some Democrats about the amount of testing that went into their the ads that they were eventually going to put up on air, right? Make a bunch of ads, test the heck out of them. Whatever moving the needle the most, those are the ads that get up. It sounds like your testing was basically, hey, does the president like this?
Well,
Does the
look,
team like
that,
this, or
yeah,
how much did was it just truly a Trump vision versus you were also doing the other analytics?
yeah, you do both, but you have to understand what I learned about. In fact, it was funny. One time I was presenting the president, and I started to say, "Well, here's the strategy behind this. Why I want to do this." He wants to hear nothing about that. He doesn't want me to say, "Here's what the demographic says. Here's what the polling data says." He wants me to show him the ad, and he's going to decide for himself. That's just how he is. And one of the things I learned too is I had to sustain everything that I had learned doing this for decades and realize in this particular race, everything is paradoxical. Maybe the best example of the court cases, and I think that's what you were referring to before,
Yeah,
in the sense that you would think that they could doom a candidate. I mean, my God, these were very serious things that they were doing, that they were the allegations at least. There was one after another, and he was stuck. And don't forget, they also tried to keep him off the ballot in states like Colorado, saying he couldn't even get on the ballot. That went to the Supreme Court. The point was, though, what Trump understood very much was particularly Republicans early on were not going to see these as prosecutions. They were going to see these as persecutions. And
mm-hmm.
we can have a discussion and we can disagree on this, but my personal feeling is the Democrats way overplayed their hands. In fact, I had one analyst on TV, a Democrat, basically who on a Leslie show called me and said, I think the Democrats are doing this because they want Trump on the ballot in November, because it doesn't make sense to us. These are all helping Trump. And they did. We saw the Republican numbers. People rallied back behind them because they thought this was overkill. They're going after this guy. So we ran a number of ads talking about each of the individual prosecutors or putting them all together. What we learned was people do want an explanation, though. A lot of crisis communications, programs and problems that you're trying to solve. It's like we want to lower the press. We want to make this go away. We want it to be a one-day story. Trump actually had this instinct saying, no, we want to embrace this. We want people to see what they're doing to me. And what it truly did is it fundamentally changed the primary. I mean, it put people like DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and even Mike Pence, who came out particularly on the Bragg case in New York, saying defending the president. Now,
Right, right.
during the debates, which Trump wasn't even participating in, they're all there spending their time saying how terrible this is against the president. And so, did the Democrats overplay their hands? I think so. People could make arguments other ways, but I think so. And even getting back to the ad testing, it was very clear for us to see sort of what the Harris campaign was doing. And I always say, once she got into the race, this really was no longer about President Trump. This was a race for the Harris campaign, I believe it should have been, to define her. And it was a
Right.
race for us to define her. What were you going to say to whom that was going to change their opinion about Donald Trump in any way, positively or negatively, that over the course of his life, he hasn't already developed that brand or your opinion of him? And what we could clearly see is they were testing stuff like democracy is at risk.
Right.
Okay. And we all know these things. We all do this. We have polls where we put push questions out there. If you knew this, would you be more or less likely to vote for it? And a lot of times campaigns fall in love with the answers, and the answers are oftentimes just what any normal person would say to that question, but they really don't care about that issue. Of course, who's going to answer? No, I really don't care about American democracy being overthrown. Now, I will say this, we further tested that and found it was an even split of who they felt was more likely to
Exactly.
do that, Harris or Trump.
it goes back to your court case issue. We'll get at that question because the theory of the case, both from Biden and Harris, was even though we are the incumbent party, we can win by making this election a referendum on Donald Trump, what he's done that is controversial, and the prospect that he will do more bad things than good things if he's reelected. Do you think that what you're suggesting then is that really was a mistake in their strategy, trying to make it about Trump? They should have spent more time making it about what who Harris was and what she was going to do.
I mean, look, in my opinion, Harris was given a great gift. She got to introduce herself just a few months before an election. She got to distance herself from Biden, which she never effectively did. In fact, we all know the famous
That's
interview where can you think of one thing that you would do differently? No, I can't think, but she had that opportunity to start. And there were hints of some things they were doing, which I thought was very good. This is a generational change.
Right.
The whole Joy campaign was actually a good thing. And we were seeing that in our polling data. In fact, we backed off on some of the things we were saying about her personally. And in fact, if you look at almost every ad that we ran once she was in the race, it featured her talking in some ways. What we felt is we did not want this to become a he said, she said. We wanted this to become a she said, she said. In other words, like the very first ad that we ran against her when she got in the race was when Lester Holt interviewed her about the border and said, well, she said, I've got to do all these, I've done all these. He said, well, you are the borders are, but you've never gone to the border. And she said, no, I haven't, but I've also never been to Europe. What's that got to do with anything? I can't write that well. I mean, her saying that is way more powerful than me showing an image of her and saying something. Over and over again, we found stuff either she said in the past or current. And so we just felt this was a race to brand her the way we wanted her brand. The other thing that we were noticing, they actually had an advantage in that they had way more money in the month of August and early September than we did. And, you talk about campaign decisions and giving credit sometimes. Susie Wiles was getting a lot of pressure telling us, loosen the purse strings, spend money now. Don't wait till the end. And she said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with our plan. We're not going to all of a sudden front load all this money. And it was the right decision, certainly in retrospect. But they were spending a lot more money than us. But what we noticed all the way through the campaign, once we reached parity, is for every ad we were running, they were running 4 or 5 ads. And these weren't, you could make an argument because we would run ads sometimes in micro channels, like the president's plan to end taxation on tips. We were running that very heavy in Las Vegas, a place that, where you have a big service industry. We were targeting younger voters with that.
When you say targeting, is this coming in? And I want you to talk about this too, about, John, when I met you, the only way you advertised was on television, right?
Right.
You made an ad, you literally, in the days when we were doing this, you would drive it to the TV station or mail it to the TV station and they'd put it on air. Now, when you talk to us about this level of micro targeting and how campaigns are making that decision.
Yeah, well, right. It'll change. I mean, literally at our company at 4:00 every day, every employee stopped whatever they were doing because we had to overnight all the tapes to stations all around the country, and it was a big effort.
Right.
Now you're electronically sending them an hour. They're getting there an hour later. But here's where the big change. It used to be whoever could dominated basically broadcast news won the election, and Jeopardy and all these things around it. Whoever could spend more on TV had a huge advantage and so forth. Well, certainly there's a lot of waste in doing that, but still you're reaching everybody a lot of times. Where the shift has come now, it's not about expenditures, it's about audience. We sit there and we first start with who are we talking to? And then we develop campaigns around those very specific audiences in 2 ways. What do they care about? What are they voting on? Why would a 75-year-old retired blue collar male is not going to vote and look at an election the same way as a young African American male, who just got his degree, in
Yep.
living in suburban Atlanta. So that's number one, is the issues they care about. So you can micro target as far as, let's talk to them about how we're going to impact their life, not this sort of generic campaign. Second of all, how you reach them. I mean, we can go to Hulu, the platform, and say, here's exactly the people we want to reach and match it with them. And here's the ad we want to make sure that they get. And it's very targeted of how we can do this. And so you can run sort of these mini campaigns. The one problem I had with the Harris campaign was they were running lots of ads, but they were running a lot of them on broadcast and cable, the same ad, cable nationwide. And so it was like nothing was cutting through because it was like, I almost felt like they were throwing something out there, hoping something was gonna work. Now, again, they might have had data that said this is working perfectly. The nice thing about when you win an election, you sound smarter than
Yeah,
maybe you
you
are
do.
because
Exactly.
you can blame everything they did and say, oh well, that was idiotic. I mean, but it certainly wasn't lost on us though that they did say at the Harvard seminar after the election that they ran a flawless campaign that just didn't win. First of all, there's a little naivety in that there are no such things as a flawless campaign on any level.
Right.
Certainly not a presidential level. That if you ran a flawless campaign, God bless you, because it's the first time in history. Unfortunately, as you said, you didn't win. But there were certain things like that I just didn't understand why they were doing that. If you really look, what happened is she got a bump right when she got in the race for two reasons. People who said, I'm just not going to vote for Joe Biden. That's why he had to get out of the race, right? She got a lot of those people back. And people did like sort of the fresh energy of some of the things she was doing. And then they went into a completely different campaign. They started to attack Trump and the whole overthrow democracies. I mean, just things they shouldn't and didn't have to do. And I think it hurt her. And I think we used a lot of what she said about things that people said that seems out of touch with what I'm looking for out of a president. And,
Right.
in some ways it was a close election, some way it wasn't. I know the Dems were saying that they were seeing closing on all people deciding late that they were picking up winning by 10 points. But when you really look at it, we did not see that in our polling data at all. And end of the day, we didn't know we were going to win every battleground. We thought we were going to win enough that we were going to win. But, there was no guarantee that we were going to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and we did. So the only way we can conclude from that is that the late breakers did break towards President Trump.
A quick break. We'll be back with John Brabender. It might be a political odd year, but here at the Cook Political Report, we're as busy as ever. Over the last few weeks, we've rolled out our race ratings for governors, the House, and the Senate. It's not too early to think about next year's midterms, and we have everything you need to know about these races. But it's only available to Cook Political Report subscribers. So don't wait. Join us. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers.
John, let's talk about the other piece of the sort of media landscape here, which is the social media, whether it's podcasters or YouTube or Facebook and Instagram, all of that stuff. The conventional wisdom is that Trump was able to just dominate all of those mediums, and that in general, conservatives have been doing so much better in those mediums. So I would love to get your perspective on that and sort of what it tells us, especially for campaign professionals, about how to communicate with voters, especially voters who just aren't on the typical aren't getting their information from the channels that people like us do, i.e.,
Right.
actual news sites.
Yeah, one of the things I did learn, and we did do ad testing. I mean, we did it later in the cycle, but we did do ad testing, but we didn't sit there and necessarily say, well, that's the winner, based
Mm.
upon the ad testing. But and ad testing was, I remember, because every Friday I would have to have all the ads in that I had, and they were going to be tested and all this. And I always sit there and say, here's the ad. I really like this ad a lot. I hope this ad scores and through the roof. And sometimes it didn't. The ad that I really would have pushed on with and what the one commonality that I started to see was the ones that were a little bit more organic, the ones that looked a little bit more real and didn't look overproduced, were the ones that were actually scoring the highest. I
Mm-hmm.
wrote a case
Mm-hmm.
study and I said,
Mm-hmm.
what we learned were two things. First of all, reality TV beat feature films. We did have a lot of those ads with, you would have seen Ronald Reagan run years ago with great cinematography and all these things, feel good things. But it seemed like ads from a bygone era almost, that people wanted more reality thing. So, as I say, we really started to think less like a feature film cinematographer and much more like a Netflix programming director in the content that we were producing, which meant it had to be more real life. It had to be very quick. It had to be timely. We even started to time things. For example, we put out an ad on Christmas Day, which isn't that unusual, but it was an ad about Trump going to visit the troops on Christmas Eve in a war-torn area where, and it was narrated accidentally by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And the reason I say accidentally, I had no idea. I'd actually presented a bunch of Christmas idea ads to Trump, which he thought I was out of my mind. I wanted to reenact his scene from Home Alone. And he had no understanding why I would want to do that. Things that I thought were kind of funny. He didn't always have the same sense of humor. But I was at a rally in Florida, and Sarah Huckabee spoke and gave this narrative about this thing. And I asked them for the video of that when I was done. And we found the actual footage and photographs of when the trip happened. But it went out Christmas Day, and it's the only day it ran. But exponentially, it went way up because people loved the idea it was a Christmas ad released on Christmas Day. We hit Nikki Haley in the primary with an ad, and we released I made it into a football ad because I knew I wanted it to be on Super Bowl Sunday that we released it, of what that would do exponentially socially. So she had challenged us to prove that she had ever said that she was going to raise the age of Social Security. So we did this ad where it shows, instead of a red challenge flag that comes out in an NFL game, it was a red MAGA hat. And then we show the clip of her saying it on the big screen, and the official comes on and says, after further review, clearly Nikki Haley said. And so it went out on Super Bowl Sunday. And because of that, it was our Super Bowl ad. And we saw socially. And I got to give a lot of credit to the Trump people on the ground who did things like take him to Sneaker Con in Philadelphia and release a new Trump sneaker. And it was really, I'm watching this thing thinking this is going to be a disaster. And I'm watching it on TV. And when he first came out, there was all these boos. By the time he was done speaking, the whole place was cheering and they're signing all these autographs. It's like, it was amazing. Or we all remember most of us remember Michael Dukakis sticking his head of a tank back,
Mm-hmm.
in presidential, and the cringe factor of that was horrific, right? Yet Trump can drive a garbage truck or sit at, hand out McDonald's French fries,
McDonald's. Yeah.
and it looks perfectly natural, and part of that is a transition in the world we live in. Part of that is Trump coming out to an MMA fight where, the whole crowd goes crazy, or the podcast that he went on. Again, I get no credit for that. That was run by different operations, but put him on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. How many presidential candidates do you think could do anything for 3 hours?
Well, that's the real question going forward, John, because here you have all this incredible experience with this campaign, presidential level campaign, the amount of money and testing and expertise you have from this experience. And yet he's also like a once in a generation kind of candidate. Is this the kind of thing that other candidates can replicate?
I don't believe so. I believe there's lessons to be learned that they can take advantage of.
Yeah. Okay, so what things could a normal candidate not named Trump to take from this?
First of all, how people view content has changed
Mm,
dramatically. The
mm,
old way of doing really nice, just polished ads, the viewer has changed over time. They can smell anything that's not authentic or real. They can smell manipulation. I mean, all these things where an ad that would have been seen and celebrated 20 years ago absolutely would fail today. Second of
mm,
all, what we talked about is the whole idea of micro campaigns, of understanding is that there are, just significant audiences. I mean, I can tell you one of the polling questions that we would ask is, particularly in the Republican primary, do you agree with Donald Trump on his policies? And do you think his style and tone is exactly what America needs to change our country for the better? Or do you agree with him on his policies, but are oftentimes uncomfortable with how he conducts himself? And in a Republican primary, the first one was overwhelming the answer, but that second audience was the most important to us because those would have been the most likely then to say, so maybe I'll go with Ron DeSantis or maybe I'll go with Nikki Haley. So we figured out who they were, and they were very specific oftentimes. They would lean to be more women, they would lean to be more younger, they would lean to be more moderate, those type of things. So you start to understand that, well, we have some work to do with them. We're going to do a specific campaign to remind them of things that President Trump did that they may not know. And then we would test some of those, such as the fact that he had given more funding to African American colleges than any other president in history was actually an important thing to them. They saw him in a different light. It was different that, and the problem with Trump too is there's sort of this persona that's people sometimes make assumptions about him and talk to the Gold Star. I did a lot of work with the Gold Star families from Afghanistan. And no one ever knew this story, but President Trump had them to Bedminster and they had some specific issues and they were supposed to be there for 20 minutes for a meeting with the president. And they were so grateful because they were having trouble getting the Trump or the Biden administration to even have a meeting with them. Well, someone came in and said, Mr. President, time's up. But he goes, what do you mean time's up? We're going to serve these people dinner and I'm going to be there with them and we're all going to go into the ballroom and we're going to have dinner together tonight. These people have, nobody, that wasn't on the schedule. He went ahead, then even gets better. He goes, I made a special playlist for you. He does that all the time. He makes his own play. And he said, you guys are going to dance tonight. I know how difficult a time. He ended up spending 4 hours with them, including giving marriage counseling to two of them. I mean, no one ever sees that side of him. And from my standpoint, where I'm trying to tell him his story, I'm always looking for ways for people to see that.
John, that is such an important insight, this idea of the ads that worked in previous eras not, and that voters now sniff out the authenticity thing quicker than ever. And that's what I also want to ask you about, the worries among many about AI and how good AI is getting, right? And so, as you said, what worked really well was here's Kamala Harris in her own words saying these things. Do you worry that we're going to get to a place, especially for down ballot candidates, right? Everybody knew who Kamala Harris was. Everybody knows who Donald Trump is. You're some candidate running for the House. People don't know who you are. And now up comes an ad, which is totally made up by AI, saying, well, he said these things. Well, she did this thing. Is that something that we should be worried about?
I think it is. I think in the short term, I worry about it, less in the long term, because I think they will be able to figure out AI pretty
Mm,
quickly where it can be identified as AI. I do believe that, but I think it'll take a little bit of time. And here's
mm,
from my standpoint, there's even a different problem. I think there's appropriate uses of AI where I don't want to just blanket AI. I mean, if I
mm,
can recreate something using AI where it's accurate, where, we're seeing, for example, now that we can take old footage, but make it now look a little bit newer so you can run it, or we can have photographs come to life. And it's really an interesting thing. And we're actually doing some ads for fentanyl now, where one of the problems is we're trying to show people how deadly it is, all these other things, and that certain things happen to your body, like you age rapidly. And we're using AI to show a person have all these things happen, including aging rapidly right in front of their eyes. I think that's a good use of AI. It lets people understand this person's really not aging like that. But so I think the challenge is going to be how do you allow for creativity using AI, but giving people the comfort level that this is really real. And there has been other examples in other countries where they've used it with even less integrity that's done here. But look, AI is going to, it's not going to be just the
Right.
political industry, it's going to be wide ranging. And I do think that, at least I'm very hopeful that they will have the ability to identify accurate, realistic versus just looks like it. I can just tell you internally because we work on this stuff every day. What we could do today visually versus 6 months ago is so dramatically different as far as
Just six
authenticity
months ago.
just
That's
6 months ago
remarkable.
that I
Remarkable.
can't even imagine what 6 months from now or the 2016 or 2026 election cycle is going to show. So you are totally right to have concerns. It needs to be addressed. I think the industry is addressing it, but I'm hoping that the technology for detection
Hmm.
stays up with the technology for creation.
If you're talking with a 2026 candidate, they come to you, they say, hey, I want to run for Congress, I want to run for the Senate. Give me some advice based on all of your experience, especially in these last year or so, on how I should conduct this campaign, how I should think about messaging, how I should think about presenting myself to voters. What would you say?
First of all, in that case, I always speak to myself to say, look, don't fall in the trap of thinking you know this business well enough because I've been doing it for 100 years,
Right.
because
Right.
it has changed so much that it's arrogant to think that we know. And I
Yep.
tell clients that, prospective clients that right away, saying, look, if you're expecting me to come in here and tell you what your first ad is, I can't do that. I need to get to
Yep.
know you. I need to get to know your story. What I do think, what I do think is more important than ever is exactly that word story. I don't look at it anymore as what's our next ad. I look at it as what is the story that we're going to tell all the way through election day, and then how is each ad going to reinforce some part of that story and make it relevant to the audience? And so oftentimes now I will look at it and saying, okay, if we're going to run 5 ads, here's how those are all going to work together, and here's ad one. I also look at polling completely different. I think we have to stop falling in love with the questions that
Mm.
we asked for 40 years and think that that's really giving us the right answers and the insights that we used to. And I spent a lot more time, for example, reading verbatims. I used to hate focus groups because I thought how silly this is to take 10 random people and one person can say, I hate that ad. And if the candidate's sitting there, that ad's dead. I still don't like the idea of them playing Siskel and Ebert, but what I have found is if you really listen, they will say things more authentic than I would write. The most famous focus group story is how they came up with the Got Milk campaign.
Mm.
They for years milk sales were going down, and so they decided to do focus groups on why. And they brought in all, and people just would repeat the same thing. Why do you drink milk? It's because it builds strong bones, and the same thing their ads have always said. Yet the sales are going down. And finally, they were at the end of doing the focus groups, and they were like in the very last one, and there was some woman who hadn't said anything, and they said, "Ma'am, we invited you here to your talk. What do you think about milk?" And she just paused and said, "To be honest with you, I don't think anything about milk. In fact, the only time I think about milk is when I have chocolate chip cookies and I open my refrigerator and I'm out of milk." And what they realized is they didn't have to sell the value of milk, they had to sell avoiding the absence of milk and
Mm.
remind people don't run out. And that's what led to the Got Milk tagline and an increase in sales because people were every time they're at the grocery store, they started to say to themselves, do we have milk? And to me, there was brilliance in that. And I think campaigns have to be more like that. We have to be really good listeners rather than think that we're the experts we think we are and always
Did
have the
you
right
have a got
answers.
John, did you have a got milk experience in this campaign, or is there one
Um,
in a previous
I
campaign?
didn't in this campaign. I did once where, and it'll be a nameless candidate, but I remember. Well, this is really interesting. Women, they always break women and men into different focus groups,
Yeah.
right? For good reasons. And this one was two things happened. One was we got there to the focus group facility out of town, and somehow there was no audio. The ad was there with no audio. And I remember saying to the pollster, "What do we do?" And he goes, "I don't know." I said, "Well, we're here. Let's just show them." So we started with the male group and we showed them an ad with no audio, just the visuals. And they're laughing among each other. And we're there, "What do you think of the ad?" And they're like, "Well, there's nothing there. We saw some video." And we thought, "Oh, well, this is going to be a disaster." I said, "Well, let's try it again with the female panel and women's panel, see what happens." And so we showed this first ad. Immediately, they developed this conversation of what they liked and didn't like about the candidate. And it was just so amazing to me because not only showed men weren't perceptive the same way women were viewing things, women saw all these cues
Right.
of certain
Right.
things. And my favorite was the one woman said, "Well, when I see the candidate who is female, she goes, I don't know her, but I can just tell. Someday I'm going to be in line at the meat counter at the grocery store, and I'm going to have waited there for 25 minutes, and it's my turn, and she's going to walk into the grocery store and say, 'No, I'm a congresswoman. I get to go ahead of you.'" And I said, "Why do you have that perception of her?" And she said, "Well, because of the jewelry she was wearing." And it was, it sounds like
Amazing.
a silly thing, but
It's not.
it's not.
Yep.
It's not. And so we sometimes think we're smarter than we are as consultants and not take the time to really listen and understand what they're seeing, what they're hearing. We sit in a stereo studio and watch an ad and say, "Isn't this brilliant?" They sit at home and watch 150 ads during election time, and they all look the same. And so they're smarter than we are. And if we listen, they'll give us the answers.
John, this was so fun. Thank you for taking all of this time with me and with our listeners. And of course, I hope to have you back on maybe as we get into the season of ads and we can
Right.
walk through some of them.
Amy, I'm thinking a road show. I think we take it all over the country.
Perfect. And we can put on ads with sound and without sound.
Exactly.
See what people think.
Right.
I would absolutely love that. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You're our best way to get the word out about what we do. And if you want more from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman.